Again, I'm Tim Fry, the director of the Harriman Institute, and this event is brought to you by the Harriman Institute, the Earth Institute, and the International Fellows Program at SEPA. We've had a great discussion to start off this morning, and we're going to have a couple more interesting discussions. And the next item on the agenda is Jeff Sachs' speech on his important new book, JFK's Quest for Peace, to Move the World. And in our initial discussions about this event, it was very clear that for Jeff that this was really a labor of love, that this speech. And I think that's really the best reason for engaging in a project. We all write books for lots and lots of reasons, but this is clearly a labor of love. So we're very much looking forward to hearing what Jeff has to say on the topic. So please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Sachs.
Tim, thank you very much. Indeed, it is a labor of love, was a labor of love, and it's because I regard this period that we've been discussing as remarkable, important, and significant for us. And I'm going to reflect on many of the things that we have just heard in the discussion to try to put my own cast on this as a rank amateur on all of these issues, but as someone involved in public policy making for more than 3 decades, I feel that there's something quite special about this episode that has a lot to teach us. And I also do feel that while there are obviously many, many complexities to these issues, and we saw those introduced in the wonderful panel we just had. And while I also agree with Steve on the even contradictory impulses in the Kennedy administration and in the president in some ways until the end of his life, I also do feel that there is an arc here. An arc of personal leadership and an arc of historical change. And an arc of historical change in 2 ways, grand and specific. Grand, I do think that the events of 1963 were a kind of turning point in that the world avoided the kind of destruction that it flirted with in October 62, if I could use that wrong word, but that it engaged in through haphazardness and mistakes and blunders and ignorance and many other accidents. And 63 helped it to do that all the way till now. It was a proof of concept that these 2 enemies could actually agree on something consequential and use that as a way to pull back. I think that it would have been a turning point in a much more specific way as well, because President Kennedy viewed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty as a specific part of a specific journey. And indeed, as I unfortunately will have to rush off afterwards to the UN, where Kennedy's speech to the United Nations on its 50th anniversary is being celebrated this afternoon. In that speech, Kennedy lays out very practical next steps that he's envisioning for moving away from the Cold War. And in this sense, we don't know the full arc, but I believe there was an arc, that this was not only an episode, but seen very consciously by Kennedy as a way to take the steps away from the Cold War. But Kennedy constantly repeated the ancient proverb of a journey of 1,000 miles, beginning with the single step, and he also constantly cautioned that this particular treaty was not the millennium, as he said, it was the beginning. But he did see it as the beginning of a trajectory that he was determined to set, and that his assassination cut short. And I do not think that Johnson in any way was a continuation of Kennedy. It may have been a continuation of some of Kennedy's advisors' positions, but Kennedy was exercising statecraft in 1963 in the way that Mark said. And one of the real lessons of 1963, again, which Mark said, was don't listen to your advisors if you want to make changes. Why? Because your advisors will tell you everything. You'll have a range of advisors that will disagree with you. I mean, not disagree with you, disagree with each other. Your job as leader is to decide. God, I just quoted George W. Bush. I didn't mean to do that. That was inadvertent. But in any event, your job is to make choices, wise ones hopefully, listening to advisors, but bearing a responsibility, which is an individual responsibility, because outcomes are not the sum of advice. And if they are, you end up with chaotic policies, which is exactly what helped to bring about the disasters on so many occasions, and the near cataclysmic disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. My book has a couple of times been called a hagiography of Kennedy, and it's not that. Certainly, if for no other reason, I am very clear the first 2 years are just about a disaster, the first 2 years of the administration. And they culminate in October 1962. I do, however, believe that from October 1962 until the end of Kennedy's life, he was exercising a quality of statesmanship and leadership and political savvy that puts him, for that 1 year, at the highest ranks of American leadership, and that the accomplishments are very, very real, if tragically truncated and partially reversed. The starting point clearly for Kennedy coming into the presidency, as both Bob and Mark just emphasized, is a kind of is two views, and a semi-tragic view of the world in some sense, which was part of Kennedy's emotional baggage as well. One was that accidents can happen and lead to terrible outcomes, and this was the basic reading of World War I that he took from Churchill and from Lydell Hart, who in some ways were two of his great intellectual great reserves that he drew on, especially Churchill. Churchill was his dominant vision of what great statesmanship was, and Churchill, in his writing of the history of World War I, echoed by Barbara Tuchman in a bestseller that came out just as Kennedy was coming into office, said World War I was a set of blunders that shows how cataclysmic events in the world can happen by accident. And Kennedy was determined to avoid that. The second was his belief that cooperation was possible. And here, ironically, one might think of Churchill, as we do, as the belligerent who wisely and rightly understood Hitler the earliest on in UK leadership in the 1930s, and finally was allowed out of the wilderness just in time, in the very nick of time, to save civilization. But it's interesting that the same Churchill was the leading proponent in the world after World War II for the idea that there could be mutual accommodation and cooperation with the Soviet Union. And Churchill's Sinews of Peace speech in 1946, which we remember as introducing the Iron Curtain to our lexicon, was, and also as trying to cement the special relationship between the UK and the United States, was also a statement that cooperation with the Soviet Union was possible, and especially in the early 1950s, and especially after Stalin's death in 1953, Churchill was saying we need to find a way to live together. And Kennedy came into office with that view. Without question, he also came into office as a vigorous Cold Warrior who believed that if there was going to be peace, it had to be peace through strength. If there was going to be negotiation, it had to be negotiation with strength. And as the son of an appeaser by reputation, he was never going to let himself get caught from the right as being in favor of appeasement. Kennedy was first, second, third, fourth, and fifth a politician. He loved running for office. He loved winning elections. He wanted to be president, and he wanted to stay president. And he wanted to win re-election in 1964 as well. And in a famous, wonderful moment in one of his early press conferences, he's asked, Mr. President, are you enjoying being president, and would you recommend it to others? And he says, yes, I enjoy it very much, and no, I would not recommend it to others. That was Kennedy. He loved the office, and he also, though, had the sense of the potential tragedy of life, and I think that that is a deep moral sense that actually enabled him to save the world in October 1962. I think it's nothing less than that, actually, because we were so close to disaster. And I believe to move the world in 1963. Remember, he spent so much of his life in a hospital near death. He had final rites administered on many occasions because of Addison's disease, which wasn't even diagnosed until long after many death-defying episodes. He was very physically brave and very fatalistic. And it's amazing what I regard as the most eloquent words of the American modern presidency. For in the final analysis, we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Oh my God. Presidential rhetoric, no. Poetry, yes. Sophocles, yes. Shakespeare, yes. But mortal, that's his final definition of our common fate. It's a most remarkable sentiment, and he had that sentiment, and there are several occasions where he shows that sentiment in his life, staring out the window, seeing the rain, and he asks his science advisor, is there radiation coming down? Yes, coming down on the children. And he thinks about nuclear fallout, and the advisor writes about how Kennedy's blanches at this. So Kennedy's a ball of many powerful currents, emotions, ideas, and a person of his time, and a politician aiming to win office, and a politician aiming to carry the day. In the inaugural address, he says, most famously, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. He's determined from the beginning to find a way to a resolution of the Cold War. I think there's no doubt about it. And yet, what I find amazing and important for us to understand is how, with that, and he's a very, in many ways, very deep and very decent leader, almost everything falls to pieces for 2 years. It's a disastrous period, actually. The Bay of Pigs is just as stupid and blundering as one can imagine, and Kennedy's handling of it is just as bad and amateurish as one can imagine. You know, this was a CIA concocted plot. My advice to any president is, if the CIA comes to tell you to do something, show them the door. whether it's the Bay of Pigs or the U-2 flight just before the Paris summit, or the secret operations to help the Free Syrian Army. They're all stupid. This is the most failed organization in American history as far as I'm concerned. But Kennedy goes along with it. He's a newcomer. Everybody tells him you've got to do it. He prevaricates, well, yes, we'll do it, but I'm not really going to do it. I'm not going to send planes, so they'll arrive at the beach, but I don't want any planes showing. So there's no air cover. You know, I'm not recommending that there should have been air cover. I'm just saying that if you're going to do something, don't do it to fail. And he sends, gives the green light to this event, of course it's a complete debacle. And then in this remarkable set of correspondences, which is a key part of this period, where Kennedy and Khrushchev have a back-channel direct communication with each other over the entire period of the administration, and I think absolutely crucial. Kennedy does something absolutely stupid to top it off, which is to say, Khrushchev writes a letter. What are you doing? You know, your government is engaged in international piracy, attacking a sovereign country. This is crazy. I'm sure, Mr. President, you have nothing to do with it, but you should know your military is out of control and it's invading Cuba. And Kennedy writes back to Khrushchev, no, this has nothing to do with us. This is Cubans, but this isn't an American thing. And Khrushchev writes back, are you kidding? Are you kidding? Don't ever talk to me like this. This is the prelude to the Vienna summit. From my point of view, while Khrushchev has his own characteristics, and I'll come to those in a moment, Khrushchev was baldly, directly, vulgarly lied to by two American presidents in a row within a year. Because first, when the U-2 flight was shot down, that's a weather plane from Turkey. Yes, as the CIA had assured Eisenhower that if anything goes wrong, the plane self-destructs, the pilot dies or kills himself. And there was Gary Powers marched out with the full wreckage of the U-2 for international television. And then just a few months later, Kennedy is lying just at the beginning, in the stupidest kind of way, by the way. So this is how it starts. It also starts with Kennedy wanting to be strong by increasing the defense budget. It starts with Kennedy completing the placement of intermediate range missiles in Turkey, which was an Eisenhower program that Kennedy completes. Seems to me, I need to ask Mark about this, that he doesn't even reflect very much on the significance of it as it happens. It just kind of happens as a continuing bureaucratic operation of completing the missile placements, but of course it's hugely significant from the Soviet point of view to all of a sudden have missiles immediately on your border in Italy and in Turkey. And of course it's one of the reasons for the provocations that come in '61. Then comes the summit, as we talked about. Kennedy felt very drained and battered by the summit, but he actually did a very good job at the summit. I think he did an amazingly good job. He basically held the line, said Berlin for us is central. Don't step there. And Khrushchev got it. And then interestingly, it was in those months as the crisis was revving up that the mass emigration from East Germany via East Berlin to West Germany and the West was taking place. And that was hugely embarrassing for the Soviet Union and even more for the GDR. And so the wall was put up suddenly in August '61, and it was Kennedy's correct judgment immediately by good instinct, this is a good thing. This is not a bad thing, this is a good thing. not that he's in favor of a wall, but he understood intuitively from the first moment, this will ease a crisis. And after the wall went up, the whole Berlin threat just went away. Of course, what didn't go away was Khrushchev's stupid idea that he'll get even. And this is, of course, a remarkable and well-known story, but no less remarkable for being well-known. Khrushchev hatches the idea, we'll kind of show the Americans a thing or two of their own medicine, and decides to put missiles into Cuba. And it's wonderful, in a way, wonderful, weird, but to read the Soviet reactions to this. He tells Gromyko about this. Gromyko says, "Are you crazy? That'll start a war." "No, this has nothing to do with war. Just calm down. We got to teach the Americans a little bit of their own medicine." And then he goes to the Politburo. Everyone's aghast. "Are you nuts? This is some harebrained scheme." "No, don't worry. War, it's the last thing on our mind." I think this is very, very interesting. Then, by the way, lots of lies, and then, of course, from the right in the United States, lots of warnings that Cuba's being an armed military base, the Soviets are going to put nuclear weapons there. Kennedy says, "No way, impossible. We have full assurances they'll never do that." And, of course, then they discover them, and Kennedy immediately feels politically they've got to come out or I'm going to get impeached. This is a devastating security issue, but even more, it's a devastating political crisis for the United States and for me. We have to confront this. I've been lied to on the most sensitive issue in the world. And the events then follow that we know. What do I make of all of that first 2 years? It was not Kennedy's intention to have anything like this transpire. This was not statecraft. This was not the desire. It is that the world can go terribly wrong, first of all. The image of equilibrium in these circumstances is a completely false image. The image of balance, of terror, of mutually assured destruction, and so forth. These are false models in the real world. The world is so much more in flux than an equilibrium theory can allow. And it's the change that makes everything hard, whether it's in economics or in politics or in geopolitics. Change is the interesting dynamic. Static circumstances are easy to analyze. But the world's not static. If it were, we would have been done with political science and economics 1,000, 2,000 years ago. It's the change that's so interesting. And everything that happened in the first 2 years was off plan. All of it. There was no plan, but it was off desire. And it was bumbling, by the way, and it was one damn thing leading to another. And so that's the context, I think, that 1963 has to be understood. And let me say one word about the Cuban Missile Crisis and then turn to 1963. As Steve recounted in the Cuban Missile Crisis, well, one point that I slightly disagreed with, Kennedy was not among the strong hawks, except at the very beginning, but only really the first day or so. Because by the second day, he remembered the basic maxim of Lydell Hart, which was the military strategist that he probably most listened to, which is play for time. Time. Don't do something rash. And I think that that was by far the overwhelming sentiment. We don't know what's happening. We don't understand Khrushchev's motives. We don't know the circumstances. Curtis LeMay said, "Go, take them all out," and was nearly insubordinate in these meetings, muttering about appeasement and Munich and worse than Munich and all the rest. And Kennedy was playing for time, not knowing exactly what time would show. But the quarantine was first and foremost a way to do something but not shoot first. And Kennedy came to that view fairly early on. Robert came to it, I think, just about first, by saying that a surprise attack was outside the American self-image. But I think it's more deep than that. I don't think it was really about that. I think it was about, if I shoot, maybe the world will end. If I don't shoot, maybe we'll have some time to figure out something different. I think that was brilliant. At the end, as Steve talked about, Kennedy made a concession of the Turkish missiles. And he did it by sending Robert to see Dobrynin, the ambassador, no paper. And he said, I want to convey to Chairman Khrushchev the option of removing the missiles, but only under conditions that there is no quid pro quo. This is not going to happen for several months because this has to be a NATO decision. This is not a US decision. If you announce anything publicly, the deal is off. Please convey the message. Historians working on the stopwatch have since rightly worked out it played no role in Khrushchev's decision because the decision ordering the removal of the missiles had already taken place. And some people erroneously think, therefore, it was an unnecessary concession. I think that's completely wrong and misses the much larger point. The much larger point is that Khrushchev viewed that as a major step of trust building. And in the letter that Khrushchev sent to Kennedy on October 28, he expresses his great appreciation for this step. And amazingly, Khrushchev at the end pushed away, lost everything in public image from this, never made this public. I don't understand that. It's amazing. But he honored that requirement. And he wrote, I hope, Mr. President, that agreement on this matter too shall be a no small step advancing the cause of relaxation of international tensions and the tensions between our two powers, and that in turn can provide a good impetus to resolving other issues concerning both the security of Europe and the international situation as a whole. It was greatly appreciated by Khrushchev. It showed that Kennedy understood Khrushchev's situation and understood Russia's situation. And empathy is crucial here, and the sense that the other has that empathy is crucial for reaching an agreement. So 63 and the quest for peace. The essence of it, I believe, is exactly as Bob Jervis put it so succinctly an hour ago. There are gains to cooperation, but they're just damn hard to get to. And that if you look at the fundamental conditions, there's something irrational about the outcomes, but we know from game theory, its central proposition of the prisoner's dilemma, that these are individually rational but collectively irrational outcomes. In other words, an arms race, an escalation may make sense to each player, but lead to a disastrous outcome. And that's the whole theory of cooperation in every sphere, that there are gains to be had, but achieving those gains is not easy. And I view 1963 as strongly holding that view and trying to find a way to implement that view. It's not easy to implement that view because when you are looking from one side in a tit-for-tat conflict or an escalating race, not only rationally are you led to escalate, because that's the whole theory of individually rational behavior, but you are emotionally driven to a state of frenzy. I tweeted out this morning that I appreciated Putin's op-ed in the New York Times. I did it consciously, knowing it was a little bit of a probe into Twitter land, or Twitter space. And I've gotten a host of aggressive responses. You idiot, how can you trust them? How can you do this? How can you do? Fine, that's interesting. This was just a little experiment in the morning. except for the fact that I also believed what I wrote. I never write anything purely for an experiment because the words will come back to haunt you for a long time, so you better believe what you write. But the emotion that we invest in struggle is one of our most dangerous human traits. We now understand better and better that it is completely built into our genetic code. E.O. Wilson's Social Conquest of the Earth, written this year, is probably the definitive account by the world's leading biologist of this dual reality of humanity, that we have capacity to cooperate, but we also have the us versus them syndrome, and that it is not just our cognitive prefrontal cortex, but it is also our full emotional, or even more, our full emotional apparatus written into this. Kennedy was a cool character, and he wanted to calm things down at this point. And the truth of the matter is that both Kennedy and Khrushchev were scared out of their wits by what had happened in October. And Khrushchev is asked in one wonderful response, were you afraid during the Cuban Missile Crisis? And his answer, I'm paraphrasing, is, are you kidding? I was terrified. Any human being would have been terrified at the moment. And there was no more human individual than Khrushchev, the opposite of an automaton, impulsive, genuine, actually desiring peace, almost destroying the world, so many contradictory things. But he felt the terror of it, and so did Kennedy. And I think Kennedy must have been completely shocked also by what he had helped to bring about, because he had gone into office to do the opposite of what happened. He had come into office as a rational, clever, strong, effective young leader and nearly brought the world to ruin and was a contributor to that. So 63 was trying to find a way to honor the underlying logic of cooperation. And there's no doubt in my mind, Steve, that they were looking for a tie in one sense, which was Khrushchev's concept was peaceful coexistence. Kennedy's concept was we will be competitive on economic and other fronts, but we don't have to have an arms race, a nuclear spiral, much less war. And so I think they were looking for a tie. And I think that it's important that by then very, very disaffected author of Containment, George Kennan, was very much a kind of let's look for a tie thinker, because Kennan held the strong view, which turned out to be completely right, that the Soviet system was so profoundly flawed that given time it will collapse from within. And the job outside is not to defeat it militarily. The job from outside is to contain its dangerous instincts of probing in dangerous ways or taking local advantage. But a tie is what we want in some sense, because the long term there was full American confidence that in the end things will move in the direction of away from a totalitarian, centrally controlled, militarized economy, that in the end this system makes no sense. And I always, by the way, enjoyed John Maynard Keynes's reflections on Russia made in 1925, because he went as the brilliant political economist he was, and he came back and his basic verdict was, nope, there's nothing to learn from here, this is stupid. It's very religious, he said, it's got messianic impulse, it's got many things, but we're not going to learn much economics from this. And I think it was a very good judgment. So a tie is what they wanted. We'll compete, for sure, but we don't need to fight it out everywhere. If you are a leader trying to do this in the height of the Cold War, what do? That's not easy. From an individual country's point of view, first, the other side is perfidious. They're liars, cheaters, schemers. And they were. The United States lied and cheated and was perfidious, and so was the Soviet Union. So in an arms race, in a prisoner's dilemma situation, both sides are cheaters, often in the pre-cooperation phase. So what do you do actually to reach that Pareto frontier, to use the economics jargon that Robert talked about? I think you have to first, well, Kennedy's idea is really embodied completely in the June 10 speech. The speech is a speech of ideas, first of all. And then it's a speech of emotions. And it's a speech of values. It's completely unusual for a presidential speech. It doesn't tell the Soviet Union to do anything. It's all about this existential crisis, not about what the other side should do. And interestingly, not exactly, but 10 years before, Eisenhower had given a speech called the Chances for Peace speech, which was on the immediate follow-up to Stalin's death, and Eisenhower's correct assessment that there was something that could follow from that in terms of cooperation. But you compare the two speeches, it's quite fascinating. The Chances for Peace speech in 1953 is a list of things the Soviet Union must do. If you're in a prisoner's dilemma, that's not very convincing. It's telling the other side, you must cooperate, you must cooperate, you must cooperate. But the whole idea of the prisoner's dilemma is, why should I trust the other side telling me to cooperate when they're going to defect? And so Kennedy plays it completely differently in his mind, in the feelings. And one of the strongest parts of this is his feeling that Khrushchev is in the same position. I think this is one of the uncanny aspects of this. Kennedy comes to feel a kind of bond personally with Khrushchev and says on several occasions to aides, you know, he's in the same situation I am, meaning we're surrounded by hardliners. We got to figure out a way to get out of this. He's alone, I'm alone. And so Kennedy's trying to find a way out. He's trying to find a way out from a structural trap, which is exactly the security dilemma. And no one has put it better than Bob, because it's not only the prisoner's dilemma, it's also all the emotional and also all of the psychological and misreading factors that go into that structural circumstance. Everything you do is misinterpreted for the worst. And so how do you get out of such a structural bind? This is why this is such a great achievement in my view, just a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Part of it is you need a deep answer to the deep politics. And that's what Mark, I think, opened the eyes of the world to in his great book on constructed peace, which is that at the core of this lay Germany. And Germany really was a huge, huge problem, more than we can imagine today. We have to remember it back in 1963. This was a country that had nearly destroyed civilization twice in a row, that had done more damage than any other country in history because it had the technology to do it, that had committed the Holocaust. And the Soviets weren't too keen on a unified, robust Germany once again. And you can't blame them. And that's part of Kennedy's empathy, that he got that. Eisenhower didn't get it. Eisenhower, as Mark described, was a frugal, budget balancing, in many ways wonderful person, by the way. But he misunderstood this central dynamic. And Kennedy did not. And Kennedy was ready to take on the old man, Adenauer. And it was a crucial part of taking away basic obstacles, because there are structural things that need to be done to reach that Pareto improving frontier. And Germany was at the core of that. Then second is the question of how do you build cooperation in a world of seeming anti-cooperation and lies? The first thing you have to do is explain the prisoner's dilemma. Now, if you or I were doing it, we'd get up and make a presidential address. Let me explain the prisoner's dilemma. And your audience would be ready for impeachment hearings immediately. Of course, Kennedy doesn't put it in these terms, but he does put the concepts plainly in this speech. And he ends up saying that peace is the rational end of rational men, meaning it is irrational what's happening. Of course, not in the narrow Nash equilibrium, but in the outcome sense. We're leading to mutual disaster, not mutual benefit. We can do better than that. We can do better than this. And he explains, Eisenhower did also, by the way, beautifully. He said every jet we build, every fighter plane we build, how many hospitals, and he actually goes through in his Chances of Peace speech explaining the trade-offs on the budget. But he didn't come up with US proposals in the same way as, and he made too many demands. So Kennedy explains the structure of the prisoner's dilemma and the structure of this need to find a way forward. Then he humanizes it. And this is extremely important because rationality is only a limited part of our mental makeup, and it's only a limited part of our capacity to achieve human purposes. And I think Kennedy's most brilliant part of this is his statement that no system is so evil that it means the people are lacking in virtue. And we should hail the Russian people for their great accomplishments in science and space and economic and industrial development, and their acts of courage. Courage is Kennedy's highest term. I think it's no accident that he hails the Russian people for their courage, because courage for Kennedy was, like in ancient Greece, the highest accolade of virtue. You can imagine what Khrushchev would feel about this, and he did. It reached Khrushchev on an individual basis. He was speaking to Khrushchev. Of course, he was speaking to the Russian people, and he was speaking to the American people. But when's the last time we heard a president hail the Iranian people, one of the greatest civilizations in human history, and for their many contributions? It's unthinkable right now. And this is exactly what Kennedy did at that moment. He hailed the Russian people in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was guts. And then he ends up putting it into the third and deepest mode. First is the rationality. Second is the process. He talks about peace as a process, a way of solving problems. First definition of peace is that it's the rational end of rational men. Second, peace is a process, a way of solving problems. And then he ends up, isn't peace just a human right itself? Isn't this part of our fundamental humanity? The right to live out our lives with our families, with our children, in safety, in security. And so he has humanized a conflict that had defied humanization up until now. It's gorgeous, this speech. It's gorgeous. It's completely, in my understanding, maybe Michael can find some good examples for us, it's unprecedented in my view. Let us re-examine our own attitudes. Let us understand that our attitudes are as important as theirs. Let us humanize our worst enemy, the one that almost brought us to full destruction, the one that lied to us just a few months ago. And all of this was needed because actually the idea of a partial nuclear test ban treaty had been on the table for years, and it had defied everybody, and every accident kept coming up. Kennedy decided to go for it, very much encouraged by his personal relationship with Khrushchev as well as his tragic sense of life. Khrushchev got it, as you know, called Averell Harriman, said this is the finest speech by an American president since Franklin Roosevelt. Let's make peace. And within 7 weeks, they cleared a lot of obstacles. And there were a lot of obstacles. The most important technical obstacle had been over on-site inspections. And Robert referred to this, how many, in what terms. The Soviets really believed that US on-site inspections would be a prelude to first strikes, and there were US generals that loved that idea, by the way. So it's like the security dilemma. You know, in a spectrum, you can't say, no, that's crazy. Someone on the other side holds that view. And the Soviets did not want Americans doing their 20 inspections of every weapon site, installation, and so forth. And that had held things up. And finally Khrushchev agreed, okay, we'll just put underground tests aside, and we'll have the so-called three environments treaty of space, the atmosphere, and underwater. And that's how they resolved one of these conflicts. Well, there were many other things. Would there need to be a peace treaty beforehand and so forth? And Harriman deftly said, no, please, let's just move to an agreement. But emotionally, Khrushchev had also decided, yes, we should have an agreement right now. It's time to have an agreement. This is where all of these factors, Kennedy's decision in the preceding October to remove the Turkish missiles, everything plays in. Do you have the dynamics to break through so many obstacles? It's not a two-party game as in our papers. There are large numbers of parties on both sides. It's a confusion. It's a provocation. It's many people on your side telling you, don't you dare do this, this is treason. How could you ever agree to trust the other side? And so you have to clear lots of obstacles in order to make this happen. Finally, Kennedy needed to get this through the Senate. And he wanted to be president till 1969, January 20. He wanted to win re-election in 1964. And he did not want to lose like Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson has hung over every American president since the defeat of the Treaty of Versailles and the treaty in the US Senate. And Kennedy was very, very explicit about this. It's also fascinating to me how the Lodge family, which was so much responsible for Wilson's defeat, was completely intertwined in Massachusetts politics as a foe of the Kennedy family. And I don't think he wanted to lose to the Lodges again. And so he was very cognizant of taking every step right. Wilson had made disastrous blunders. Even till the end, Woodrow Wilson could have gotten the treaty through with Senate reservations had he respected his Senate opponents. But he, perhaps even for physical reasons of ischemia and then a stroke later, but even before that, had lost judgment and balance and was aggressively pursuing a no compromise, no politics path. Kennedy was a consummate politician. He really was a superb politician. Gifted, charming, negotiating, Machiavellian when he needed to be. No pure soul. Just, in my view, a very decent person and very skilled. And he went through and did many steps practically. One was to negotiate with the Joint Chiefs, who were relatively antagonistic, especially the Secretary of the Air Force, LeMay, and to get the Senate Republicans on board through Dirksen, perhaps also including trade-offs on completely other issues, even Justice Department issues, it's been suggested but not proved. And so in the end, when the treaty came for a vote, it was passed not just by the 2/3 margin, but it was ratified 81-19. It was a spectacular victory. And Kennedy took two lessons from this. One is that as he traveled the country to begin his re-election campaign, and that's where he died in Dallas on his 1964 campaign early stops, he was finding an outpouring of support in the United States for this initiative. In the West, in conservative areas, he was feeling that this was the right track, that the American people were breathing an enormous sigh of relief and were strongly backing the peace initiative. And he found internationally an overwhelming response as well. There were 90-some countries almost immediately signed on to the treaty, which had been negotiated among three signatories: the US, the USSR, and the United Kingdom. And then the rest of the UN joined in with, of course, the pertinent exceptions of China on the one side and de Gaulle and France on the other, who were not very happy with it. And Adenauer would have been, had he not been cornered by Kennedy and then soon replaced by Erhard, was viscerally opposed to this kind of venture. And this was part of that more fundamental settlement that Kennedy made. So Kennedy went to the UN General Assembly on the 20th of September and laid out his vision for what would come next. And it's absolutely magnificent. I'm on my way to the UN now to celebrate this speech. And he lays out an agenda which, by the way, is, for me, in development, is a stunning thing. He says we should have a worldwide center for health communications under WHO that could ward of epidemics and adverse effects of certain drugs, transmit the results of new experiments, regional research centers advancing our common medical knowledge. A global system of satellites could provide communication and weather information for all corners of the earth. A worldwide program of conservation could protect the forests and the wild game preserves, now in danger of extinction for all time, improve the marine harvest of food from our oceans, and prevent the contamination of air and water by industrial as well as nuclear pollution. And finally, a worldwide program of farm productivity and food distribution that could give every child the food he needs. It's magnificent. And this was not the end of the story. Finally, in the end of the story, let me say a word about Vietnam and how it fits into this. With all of this, and it can't get higher uplift than this, is exactly the disaster that Steve discusses, which is the coup against Diem. My first advice to presidents is get rid of the CIA, and my second advice to presidents is get rid of coups and violent regime change. It's part of America's deep legacy that goes back decades. It is almost uniformly a disaster, including up till Syria today, which is all about violent regime change of Assad. We should not be in this business. The truth is, Kennedy didn't want to be in this business. But Kennedy was pulled along. I'm not excusing it, but this was not a gung-ho policy. He was being pulled every day by the State Department. Actually, not by the CIA, interestingly, which was rather negative about this, but by the State Department and by Henry Cabot Lodge, his ambassador in Saigon. And he was being told, we must do this, we must do this, we must do this. And he was very reluctant, and finally he said, okay, do what you're going to do if it has to be, if it's the only thing that can be done. And it was a terrible decision. His heart was not in it. This was not a Kennedy-led thing, but it was a Kennedy responsibility, and it was an awful, awful result. And it's very famously known that when Kennedy hears the news that Diem was killed in this, he immediately stands up, blanched in an Oval Office meeting, covers his face in his hands, and runs out the door, and felt profoundly shamed by this and sullied by it. My own feeling, in this open, endless debate is quite strong, actually. We all have the freedom for strong views, I suppose. Kennedy absolutely hated the idea of a land war in Asia. And Kennedy had actually agreed to this neutralization of Laos in 1962 as an example of that, and that, I think, was his model. And there's, of course, the famous National Security Memorandum in October 1963 calling for the withdrawal of 1,000 advisors. Remember, there were no formal troops. There were 14,000, quote, special advisors, including secret operations. But there were not formal troops. They wouldn't come until March 1965. Kennedy told lots of congressmen, senators, this isn't proof, but he told lots of them, no way we're doing this. And he always said, after the elections next year, that's it. And I strongly believe that because he really had learned to distrust the generals tremendously. He had learned to distrust the CIA. He had learned to distrust his advisors. And he did not believe in war. He did not believe in war. But he was a politician, so he gave the order to withdraw 1,000 advisors, and he said, do not make this public. When he died, a lot of this was lost, obviously. Lyndon Johnson was not JFK in any remote sense. Not temperamentally, not intellectually, not in orientation, not in knowledge, not in experience. Lyndon Johnson had one of the finest years of American domestic political leadership in history in 1964 with civil rights and announcing a war on poverty, and it would have been enough to earn him entry into the pantheon of greatness had he been able to manage foreign affairs, which he couldn't do. And he was a disaster in foreign policy. And he knew that he was walking into a disaster. That's interesting. He had long conversations with his friend, Senator Long, saying, what the heck are we going to do? This is no win. This is awful. But he kept escalating. And the best explanation of this, I think, that's ever been given is Daniel Ellsberg's essay on the quagmire myth and the stalemate machine, that domestic politics kept leading Johnson on. And you can ask the question, well, wouldn't Kennedy have been led on in the same way? And I think the answer is no, for two reasons. One simple reason, mechanics. Johnson was in his first term and aiming for re-election in '68. Kennedy would have been in his final term. That's just pure mechanics, accident. And second, Kennedy was a lot smarter and a lot shrewder. Johnson knew it, by the way. So did Kennedy. They didn't get along. But Kennedy would not have allowed himself to get pulled into a trap of hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground for something that was known internally to be useless. There is no way that John Kennedy would have ended that way. I believe that he was on an arc of bringing the Cold War to a tide, bringing it to an end and moving to an era of peaceful coexistence. Thank you very much.
Could you comment to what extent did you think the Rand Corporation affected JFK's policy decisions? And those within his circle, as far as how was the influence manifested, or what extent did the Rand Corporation have any influence?
I'm probably not the right person to answer that. Others might. I did not find in what is, believe me, secondary research and interpretation any discernible direct effect. And don't think that it was an overwhelming direct influence around the advisors and the kind of analysis that was being done. Of course, there was lots of structural theory about what nuclear weapons could and could not do. But I don't think that in the end, the high theory, or as far as I know, the specific specific papers played a strong influence on this. But I stand to be corrected by Mark or Bob or Joe or Steve or anybody else.
Question over here.
Could somebody bring them?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Elizabeth Saunders from GOE. I very much enjoyed the book, but one question I had when I got to the end was, where's the sustainable development? Because that's, of course, what I was expecting to be bringing to this analysis, and especially because this was, of course, a huge interest of Kennedy's. And you talk about it briefly in the book, but I think it also, it cuts both ways, right? It was very much a force for peace in Kennedy's mind, but he also had a very strong belief in counterinsurgency war. And in my own work on Kennedy and Johnson, I've looked at this question of whether Kennedy and Johnson, whether Kennedy would have pulled out and Johnson was simply continuing his path in Vietnam. And I think, I agree with Joe that it was never no, but one tantalizing possibility is that they might have fought quite different wars, and that Kennedy believed in economic development and political development as a strategy of peace, in a sense that if you could transform other states and institutions, you might actually lead to more peaceful international relations. But to do so, you had to fight war in a certain way. And so one could speculate that possibly you would have proceeded more sort of counterinsurgency-oriented war. It might still have resulted in failure, but would have looked quite different. So I'm just curious as to your views on sustainable development in general. I don't think they would have called it sustainable development in the 60s for both peace and for war.
The Kennedy administration was very much steeped in, as you say, counterinsurgency doctrines, in overthrowing governments, and so forth. This is the dark, in my view, the dark and failed experience of America's Cold War, proxy war episodes, and that continue till today, as far as I'm concerned. But there has been a belief since the 1950s that destabilizing unfavorable regimes through covert means is an important thing to do. There was a view, which has ended, that adding development assistance to the mix to help the regimes we like is a good thing to do. We don't really do that anymore, by the way, except shoeboxes of money and a few other things. There's very little of it, aside from something that Michael and I worked on, which was disease control, but that was not viewed in a geopolitical context. That was viewed in a decency context, a true human context. But the whole approach, Kennedy was infused with it, Johnson worse. We love the idea of not loved it, but many championed the conversion of Latin America to a continent ruled by military powers, starting with Brazil and then going on throughout the entire continent. And that was largely US-led policy. And it, in my view, was a complete disaster. And I view Syria the same way, as I mentioned. Iraq, I think it's all part of a long-standing policy. The Kennedy administration was not unique to it, and it also wasn't immune to it. I think that Kennedy viewed this as the battle on the or his advisors, the Cold Warriors, Rostow and others. This is the battle on the margins. In the big central arena, we better have peace, because otherwise we're going to stumble to the end of everything. And so we better find a way to have more peaceful competition. And Kennedy was looking, I believe, more than his predecessors and successors at finding ways like neutralization in Laos to find a way out. But on the other hand, Cuba was an obsession, obviously, even though, fascinatingly, in the end, there are many stories. I'm not enough of an expert to know, but Kennedy, begins to reach out to Castro. Isn't there some way we can really end this direct confrontation? It's very dangerous, not good for the hemisphere. It's very indirect. It's very early. It's been implicated in the assassination itself in many narratives. I didn't go into these details to understand this or to know it. So, yes, this is America. This is our foreign policy. We're a big power. We think we can tell countries what kind of governments they should have. Soviets were filled with their own perfidious behavior. And the things I'm talking about were not the end of the story. They were a way to try to reorient. And Kennedy saw what he hoped would be a basic reorientation, and that it had to start at the top and at the center of all of this. But the CIA was and is a disaster as far as I'm concerned. Okay. So on that happy note, let me thank everybody. Because of very difficult timing at the UN General Assembly, the only time that they could schedule this 50th anniversary of Kennedy's last speech is this afternoon, and I'm going off to that. And I hate to do it, especially since Joe and I's new book is so wonderful, and Joe always has taught me so much. I apologize in advance, but I want to thank the Harriman Institute and colleagues for putting on today's discussion, and I want to thank Michael. Please, thank you for coming. I'm sorry that I'm going to miss the afternoon. It's terrible scheduling, and I'm already being told my neck's about to be chopped off if I don't leave now. Thank you.